23, 23. Is that 923 or we got 23?
No, as in 2023.
Oh,
welcome to the new year, Mish.
Is that thing that started 2 weeks ago? Okay.
Yeah, that thing. That thing that may have happened. Right, 9:31. Hang on, I need to make one of you hosts because I'm going to be busy today. Here we go, 2 co-hosts. Nice. It's good to see you all again. Thanks for being back to Neuroccino 2023. That's the year, not the time. The way Neuroccino works is everyone is welcome to come and join us debating exciting science. And usually the way it works, you just come on and you present a paper. You don't really have to prepare a presentation. So don't get confused by today's Neuroccino, because I actually did prepare a presentation, because today it's not about one single paper that we're discussing, but it is about a concept and a debate. So it actually spans at least 4 papers directly and indirectly, probably 6 or 7. So I thought it'd be better to give a presentation than to show the individual papers. But I'm gonna share the links with you in a minute as well. So here is the link with the main paper that kickstarted this whole debate. Other than that, good to see you all. Welcome back. And I won't take long and just dive into, hang on, share screen. It's the first time we're doing this. And see the flow is not there. Here we go. Can you see my screen okay? Yes, brilliant. So, as I mentioned, today's Neuroccino is about a brain debate, and there hasn't been a year since COVID-1 where there wasn't a controversial paper in Brain that kickstarted a debate. The last big one, I guess, was Dimitri Coleman's editorial, which pretty much tried to dismantle an entire scientific field by saying fMRI hasn't added much to our clinical understanding. Today, we're not attacking an entire field, but we're attacking a concept and a part of the brain which has to do with Wernicke's area. And the paper that started the debate back in 2015, so about 8 years ago, was by the Chicago group around Mesulam, where they published this paper in Brain, the Wernicke Conundrum and the Anatomy of Language Comprehension in Primary Progressive Aphasia. Now, in this paper, they put out some hypotheses of how word and sentence comprehension work in the brain, or more correctly, which areas are relevant for things to not work anymore in patients. And they put out a couple of hypotheses to reconcile the findings that they describe in the literature. Now, back in the days, these hypotheses weren't tested. So last year, a group from South Carolina, led by Matchin, actually took those hypotheses and tried using new methods, that is lesion data and connectivity data, to revisit the Wernicke Conundrum and ideally resolve some of the debate that originated from the original paper back in 2015. Now, their conclusion very broadly is that they confirm a classical Wernicke's aphasia, whereby word and sentence comprehension are impaired with a lesion to the posterior temporal inferior parietal region. So far, so good. But then the Chicago team came back with a letter to the editor and took quite an issue with that paper and the way it was presented, stating that they wrote an article that was discrediting their work and that the authors missed their target by a long shot. Oops. Can you still see the screen? Because my, whoa, what's going on here? Hang on. You still there? Okay, can you see the screen still? No.
No.
For whatever reason, my second screen just decided to switch off. Here we go. Let's hope it stays. Right, so they quite attacked the paper in the way that it was presented, and then obviously the authors of the revisiting paper replied to the Chicago team criticism on their paper. But what's quite interesting is that this debate, even though it was just published, as you can see, it's accepted manuscripts at the moment, the main author actually gave a presentation for the C-STAR series, which is akin to the clinical new anatomy seminar series, but more language focused. And there is a platform where you can rate papers by giving stars, a bit like Google evaluation. And they put their preprint on the server that I'm not even going to try to pronounce. And Mesulam picked it up and he gave it a 2-star rating out of 5, which the authors took quite an issue with. But he picked it up for his C-STAR talk and actually quoted some of the review where Mesulam actually suggested they withdraw the paper. So this was quite a heated debate. Now let's dive into it and give a little bit of background. Where does it all come from? You probably know that there's different types of aphasic syndromes, and they have a focus on being fluent or non-fluent. And in the case of Wernicke's aphasia, these patients have word and sentence comprehension impairments, but they are fluent. So they talk, but what they say doesn't really make much sense. And when you give instructions, they struggle to complete the instructions correctly. Now, what's also interesting about this work is that it's actually the first model of language in the brain, whereby he postulated that we have Broca's area in the inferior frontal gyrus, but we also have another area that is roughly in the posterior temporal gyrus, and those two areas are connected. Now, if that connection is damaged, you would have a so-called conduction aphasia, whereby comprehension is intact, articulation is intact, but what patients can't do anymore is repeat what they heard. So that propagation of auditory input to the motor output is interrupted. Now, there has been quite a lot of debate about where exactly Broca's and Wernicke's area are, and why for Broca's area we have a rough delineation of the structural functional cortical areas involved. For Wernicke's area is actually quite more divergent in the literature. So what you're seeing here is a paper by Jeff Binder published in 2015 as well, so the same year that the original Wernicke Conundrum came out. And this was a review on the anatomy and the function of Wernicke's area. And you can see here by quoting reliable references like Wikipedia, that Wernicke's area is quite divergently placed in the brain. And I briefly summarized schematically, so don't take this for granted, a couple of more references in the literature where we can see that Wernicke's area can be pretty much anywhere in the posterior temporal, superior, middle, inferior, and inferior parietal, supramarginal, and angular gyrus, depending on which type of reference you look at. Now, in the Chicago paper from 2015, they summarized this as well and came up with this area roughly being referred to as Wernicke's area, and you can see it's quite a large area in the brain. Now, anatomical delineation aside, what they also described in the paper is the new anatomy of language comprehension in primary progressive aphasia. And what they basically postulated is that if you have an atrophy in the anterior temporal lobe, your word comprehension is impaired, but your sentence comprehension is okay. Whilst if there is an atrophy in the temporoparietal cortex, you have exactly the opposite, whereby word comprehension is intact, but sentence comprehension is impaired. So in that study, they basically showed that a neuronal loss or atrophy in Wernicke's area is not associated with the language comprehension impairment. classically attributed to Wernicke's aphasia, where you have both word and sentence comprehension deficits. Now, the conundrum actually comes from looking at different patient populations. So the combination of word and sentence comprehension impairments in Wernicke's aphasia is usually seen in stroke patients where you have a posterior temporal inferior parietal lesion. And obviously stroke is based on a vascular impairment. So that could either be a occlusion of a vessel or a bleed. Whereas in PPA, you have a neurodegenerative disorder where the cortex atrophies. And you see, as I mentioned, the selective deficit with the anterior temporal lobe. Now, they put forward a couple of hypotheses of why we have that discrepancy. And they basically postulate that with PPA patients, we have a corticocentric lesion, as in the degeneration starts from the cortex and then with time propagates into the white matter, but the origin is cortical. And when you assess the patients, they are in a progressive phase, meaning that the first time you see them, they're actually at their best, and then they progressively decline. Now, they also put forward that within that area of atrophy, you might still have some neurons that are actually functional. So it's not a complete wipeout of that part. Now, for stroke is a sudden onset of deficits, and the extent can be quite focal, but it usually extends into the white matter as well. So the hypothesis they put forward is that we could be looking at a diaskesis mechanism, whereby you have a lesion in one part of the brain and a knock-on effect in other parts of the brain. They also highlighted that when you see stroke patients, they are usually in a recovery phase, meaning that the first time you see them, they're usually at their worst, and then they tend to recover over time, which obviously includes a fair amount of regeneration, functional structural regeneration. So basically what they concluded is that stroke lesions affect the white matter, and we see a deficit in word and sentence comprehension because the lesion affects the white matter and disconnects Wernicke's area from the anterior temporal lobe, but also from the frontal regions. So they put that together and actually came up with a double dissociation syndrome in stroke patients, whereby a frontal disconnection of Wernicke's area would lead to sentence impairment, and a temporal disconnection would lead to word comprehension impairments, and not the other way around, hence a double dissociation. So this brings us back to the debate. So to test the idea of the white matter being involved and a double dissociation, Matchin et al. Sorry, I don't think there's a G in his name. Sorry, autocorrect. Actually wanted to look whether the clinical presentation can be explained by a double dissociation rather than a dysfunction of Wernicke's area per se. And they had 4 different groups of chronic stroke patients, and they used a connectome-based lesion-symptom mapping approach and the Western aphasia battery revised, and basically confirmed that with a posterior temporal inferior parietal lesion, we do see that dissociation between sentence and word comprehension deficits, and largely confirmed the classical definition of Wernicke's area. Function.
Sorry, Steph.
Yeah.
Non-canon is the sentence.
Yes.
Comprehension. Okay, sorry.
Thanks for clarifying. Yeah. Now, the Chicago team came back to them and said that one of the big problems with that paper is that they only looked at stroke. And if you remember the first snippet that I showed you where they called for a withdrawal of the paper, they actually said that if they centered this paper around stroke only, he would have given 5 stars. But because they revisited his original paper without any new PPA data, it was a 2-star paper for him. And then in the letter to the editor, he also puts this figure that I copied here, where he basically says that unless you can explain that discrepancy shown in that figure, then the model is not complete. Now, the authors again came back to this quite brutal letter. Happy to send you the link so you can read it later. I'm not going to quote it. And said that the aim was to test a double dissociation using lesion and connectivity data. And they specified that apart from that double dissociation, there is no clear hypothesis that was defined in the 2015 paper. They throw back the argument that they don't have PPA data and say that they didn't actually have stroke data, which is not entirely true because it's a group of people working together and they have PPA and stroke data, but it's true in a way that in that particular paper, there is no stroke data used. They also make the point that they use the PPVT, which is a rather difficult test and has a heavy semantic loading. I'm going to come back to that in a second. They also stated that the original 2015 paper mainly puts forward the hypothesis of a double dissociation, whereas the 2019 paper later on actually discusses the hypothesis of a diathesis effect. And they also claim that they invited the team multiple times to have a fruitful discussion, but that invitation was not followed. So their reply to figure 1 is then that the ATL is important for comprehension, but it is more important for conceptual semantic processing, whereas the posterior part, and here they highlight the area SPT, which is basically tucked away at the end of the Sylvian fissure, is important for auditory motor transformation and therefore relevant for repetition deficits. And then they claim because the PPVT has quite a heavy semantic loading that it will pick up the anterior temporal lobe, but not so much the area in between the posterior temporal. And then to throw in some of our work that we actually published with Master Mesulam on repetition, just wanted to highlight this study for you where we looked at the 3 segments of the arcuate and all those language areas and actually came to the conclusion that conduction aphasia, so a repetition deficit, does not rely on the deep segment of the arcuate. So we take out the long segment, the classical arcuate fasciculus, but it's actually a deficit that relies on the indirect route via the right lobe, which then led to a model whereby a lesion can occur either in the frontal, parietal, or temporal cortex or anywhere along those 2 segments, and it will cause repetition deficit. So that kind of bridges the gap between those 2 letters and interpretations, but obviously the flavor will be quite different. Now, another paper that I wanted to highlight is this one by Hickok and Pepple, quite a seminal paper where they discussed the dual stream model of language that was borrowed from the visual literature, the where and what pathways, and basically postulate those areas to be involved and connections between them. And we can see that the anterior temporal lobe is included in this model as a combinatorial network for lexical and a lexical interface. The other thing I quickly wanted to highlight before we dive into discussion is the difference between the PPVT and the WAP-R. So this is a sample of the PPVT, the Peabody Picture Verbal Vocabulary Test, where you basically have a series of those plates with 4 pictures, and you give a 1-word cue to the patient to identify which picture they should select. So in this case, the cue would be sleeping, and then obviously they should identify picture 3. Now this test is quite long, takes between 20 to 30 minutes, and you can see where there's quite a semantic load associated with the PPVT. Now, by contrast, the WAP is much shorter, and it is a mix between real objects. So you actually put the objects in front of the patient, and rather than giving a semantic cue, you actually name the object. So there's a couple of objects in front of the patient and you say, can you point to the cup, the matches, the pencil? And then you move on to pictures. So again, you have a booklet with a couple of pictures, 4 options, and then you ask the patient to point to the matches, the comb, the screwdriver, and so on and so forth. In there, you also have colors, for example, you have numbers, and then you also have real world items. So that could be anything you can see in a hospital room or body parts. And the idea here is that you can detect category-specific loss of comprehension, which again is a semantic component. And that's all I had for you. Happy to discuss and hear your ideas on it. Anyone? Yeah. Misha.
A bunch of questions. So in terms of tests they used, like the modality for tapping into the semantic system is different, isn't it? One is auditory and the other one is visual.
They're both visual. So in both cases, you have visual cues in front of the patient.
Okay, but would you say there is a difference, there is a fundamental difference between the 2 tests, or might lead to different results from your experience?
As I mentioned, one of the differences is that with the PPVT, there's a semantic cue. So you don't actually specify what you see in the pictures. So you saw someone hugging, someone running, someone sleeping, and you say sleeping, which is more complex than having 4 objects and just do a object recognition by saying point to the matches where there is no.
I see. I'll leave Valentina to ask her question. I'll come back later.
Okay.
Thank you. It was great explaining of the debate, Steph. Thank you so much. I was thinking, so why are we defining all these symptoms raising from different pattern of lesion and disconnection as Wernicke's aphasia? Can we speak about different types of syndromes in this case? Why are we anchored to defining so many different manifestation as one single pathology?
That's a very, very good question. The reason is historical, right? Because the definition of those syndromes came about with the famous cases. And in a clinical setting, it's helpful to take a shortcut by saying a Broca-like or Wernicke-like aphasia, because you have a rough idea of what deficits that patient has. But it's a rough idea because we usually don't see clear-cut cases in the clinic. They're usually a bit more mixed. And there's actually another debate, I think that was in ticks back in the days, and the paper had a title something like Wernicke and Broca's area are dead, something along those lines. So yes, it's probably not the most intuitive to stick to those old labels, especially because they're not functionally well defined and they're not structurally well defined.
Exactly. I mean, then you end up with having assessments that don't cover well neither of the manifestations.
But that's a general problem as well. So with the WAB, and I'm a big fan of the WAB because I used it quite a lot, but it gives you a rough house number of what the problem is. And depending on the severity, it's more or less sensitive to the deficits of the patient. And especially, so in the acute stage, for example, is a great tool because most patients can actually do it. Depending on severity, as I said, if they're too severe in their language comprehension, then that test would not work. But in the chronic stages as well, the deficits might be more subtle than you can detect with a battery like the WAB. think she's happy with the answer.
Yeah, sorry.
If you wanna come
sorry.
back.
It's just waiting for my turn. Another thing that I'm surprised about is so nobody want to talk about the angular gyrus and semantics. It's just like, you know, they both like took it out of any model. Well, there is some good evidence, including the work from Vigneault and Mazoyer, that there is a good contribution of the angular gyrus into semantic or conceptual representation. And we can see it like in ideomotor apraxia, for example. So, you know, you have different nodes that are contributing to semantics. There is also the frontal one. There is a paper from Tim Challis, Elizabeth Warrington, reverse dissociation from HM, like a patient showing like some semantic memory deficit, but no episodic memory deficit in the frontal lobe after a stroke in the frontal lobe. And if you look at the meta-analysis of semantics in neuroscience, you come out with all those regions activated together systematically when you involve semantics. So I do feel like this extreme localization, whether on one track or one region, is a little bit reductionist for the functioning of the brain, since it's a function that is as large as semantics. What do you think? What's your position with that?
Similar to your approach, and that's why I also preempted this whole presentation with, I'm focusing on these 4 papers, but there is a lot more papers that actually feed into this debate. So we obviously have those, as I said, I think it was Tick's papers where they discussed the death of Roca and Wernicke. But we also have the special issue from last year or year before on the angular gyrus, where that was also picked up by most people, I think. And as I mentioned, in the clinic, we don't really see those isolated cases usually where a patient only presents with a pure semantic deficit in stroke, I should say, or a isolated lexical deficit. Is usually more mixed, which indicates that language is more of a network function than isolated tiny parts of the cortex doing a tiny part of the whole picture. And also language is a extremely fast function. We talk quickly, we understand quickly, we react quickly. If it was a hierarchical stringing together of cortical regions that first analyze semantics, lexical, we wouldn't have that speed in our conversation and the complexity in language. So yes, I do believe it's more of a network approach.
And then there is this contrast between stroke patients and PPA, and that's absolutely a different pathology. I mean, PPA, so like what you're collecting with cortical thickness is the top of the iceberg. It's like what's happening in a pathology, and because the severity of this very specific patient is always supposed to follow the same trajectory, there might be some bias in the correlation between the severity of the disease and the severity of the symptoms.
Well, also, you're absolutely right. Yes, there is a different disease mechanism. One is neurodegeneration, one is a vascular problem. The extent of the impact of the lesion is different, but also the disease mechanism. So as I mentioned, that PPA usually is a progressive disease, whereas stroke tends to be a recovery process, ideally. But also the mechanisms are different of how that actually works. And even though we call it PPA and stroke, when we actually look at the language deficits, there's many subcategories. So for stroke, you have those classical, if you want to stick with the terminology, you have Wernicke's, Broca's, conduction, aphasia, and a couple of more. And with PPA, you have the semantic variant, the logopenic variant. So it's not just one definition of patients, it's a mixed group of symptom presentations. Chris.
What about the way the debate has been discussed? I mean, it's not. I mean, yeah, I understand that you can be passionate about your position, but isn't it like it didn't seem really a really nice like a really nice discussion between the researchers, and that's not the first time that that happened, of course, but I don't think that's the way to debate a scientific idea, especially if it's actually not that clear that which side is correct or not, and even if it's the right way to explore the question. So yeah, if you like, if someone would say that Earth is flat, I think you can just say, well, that you can't write a paper about flat Earth. But in that case, it's not that clear at all, no?
Yeah, so I guess you actually looked at the paper. So I said I'm not going to quote it, but I can show you a little bit. So I thought it was quite strongly worded. As you can see here, the paper was written to discredit our work. They missed their target by a long shot. They accused them of logical fallacies, denunciating empirical findings. So it's quite strongly worded, I would say. And then also in the reply, I guess it's this one, yeah. It's a little bit less strongly worded, but it's still quite a fierce debate, I would say. And you're right, it's hard to say who's right, who's wrong. But I guess what I thought was a shame that it's this public exchange of very strong opinions, which is not necessarily bad per se, but it would be nicer to see this going a constructive way, rather than just shooting at each other. Which they both argue for in their respective letters. And the South Carolina team actually said they invited a debate about it before publication. And they also quote personal communication. Let me see if I can quickly find it. Where there was feedback on the manuscript. Here we go. Soliciting suggestions from Mesulam via personal communication, broadening the set of relevant connections to the entire brain, la-di-da-di-da. And obviously there was this pre-exchange on the preprint as well. So I think this is a missed opportunity to actually join forces and consolidate the scientific question rather than the diverging opinions. But who knows, maybe that's actually happening in the background.
Hopefully. I kind of don't really believe it.
It's a bit hard to come back, I guess, but there's always a way.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking like so brain letters are like notorious for being really aggressive, and I have a few examples in mind of exchange with Matchin or exchange between Matchin and other people that are like interesting to read, and you watch it like a box match or like a wrestling match. So is it done on purpose, or is it really motivated by an animosity between the authors? It's hard to say. One thing that is important, I agree with Chris, is people should work together, but working together doesn't mean sugarcoating all the exchange that are made in science, which is the other extreme that we see sometimes. So it's good to speak up, but remain polite.
Correct. And like I'm personally a huge fan of debates because it really carves out the differences in concepts, ideas, and methods. And some of you know that we try to have the CNS debates when Corona happened. And it's really hard to get people on record for a debate. So I think, bye, Patrick. I think it's actually very nice to have this debate, and rather than just being like, oh yeah, this is great, but how about this, actually carve out where the differences lie. My problem here is that I didn't find it too constructive by just saying, well, you don't have that data, but you don't have that data. Like, where are we going? Unless you actually combine your data and you run the analysis in both. I don't find that too helpful. But it kickstarts this entire discussion about, do we need Wernicke's labels or Broca's labels? Being inclusive here applies to both. And is the definition of the clinical symptoms actually well captured by how we describe it anatomically, or with that label that is supposedly anatomical? Mish.
Yeah. Jump on that idea. The sharing of the data is like, people have to choose whether they want to defend their own point of view or like have a chance to access a general truth about how things function. So like, if you're going for trying to access a general truth, you have no other choice than sharing your data. Otherwise, people can always come out with another set of data that is showing something different. By sharing your data, you have the opportunity for people not only to replicate, but build onto what they demonstrated. I think that's definitely forward.
Well, funny enough, we actually had the same idea and wanted to test the 2015 hypothesis. But I guess we went about it in a different way. But I don't see any more questions, and we are already over time. So thanks so much for indulging in this debate with me. And thanks for being here for the first Neuroccino in 2023. I hope to see you next Monday morning, 9:30 as always. Have an exciting week in science. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you.
Bye.